Lonely Cowboy found a woman crying at a grave. Her story changed the way he saw his past. The sun hung low over Cedar Ridge like a dying ember, casting long shadows through the twisted branches of the old cedar trees. Jake Morrison had been riding for 3 days without seeing another soul, which was exactly how he liked it. His horse's hooves made soft sounds in the dust, a rhythm that matched the slow beat of his tired heart. He was thinking about water when he heard the crying. It came to him on the evening wind, soft and broken, like the sound a wounded animal makes when it thinks no one is listening. Jake pulled his horse to a stop and sat still in the saddle, listening. The sound came again, floating between the cedar branches like smoke. For a moment, he thought about riding on. That would have been the smart thing to do. Jake had learned long ago that other people's troubles had a way of becoming your own, and he carried enough trouble already. His saddlebags were full of it. His dreams were heavy with it. The gun on his hip was marked by it. But something about that crying held him. Maybe it was the way it echoed off the rocks. Or maybe it was the loneliness in it that matched the loneliness in his own chest. Either way, he found himself climbing down from his horse and walking toward the sound. The cedar trees grew thick here, their branches reaching out like old arms trying to embrace something they could never quite hold. Jake moved quietly through them, his boots making no sound on the soft earth beneath. He had learned to walk silent in places where loud footsteps could mean death. Through a gap in the branches, he saw her. She knelt beside a small grave marked by a simple wooden cross. Her dress was plain brown cotton, dusty from travel, and her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders. Her hands were pressed flat against the fresh dirt, and her shoulders shook with each sob. Jake stood in the shadows and watched her grieve. He had seen plenty of grief in his time. He had caused his share of it too. But there was something different about this woman's sorrow. It was clean somehow, pure in a way that made his own guilt feel heavier. The grave was new. The earth was still dark and soft, not yet claimed by the desert wind. Someone had placed wildflowers around the wooden cross, but they were already wilting in the heat. At the head of the grave, a small pile of stones had been carefully arranged. Jake noticed details the way a man learns to when staying alive depends on seeing what others miss. The woman's hands were soft but strong. She wore no wedding ring. Her boots were good leather but worn thin. She had been traveling, but not far and not fast. The sorrow in her voice was fresh, like the grave dirt under her palms. He should have left then. Should have backed away through the cedar trees and ridden on toward whatever town lay beyond the next ridge. But something rooted him to that spot, watching this stranger mourn someone he had never known. The woman lifted her head suddenly, as if sensing his presence. Her eyes were red from crying, but they were steady and clear as they found his through the branches. For a long moment, they looked at each other across the small distance that separated them. "I'm sorry," Jake said finally, stepping out from the shadows. "I didn't mean to disturb you." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and sat back on her heels. "It's all right," she said. Her voice was quiet, but not weak. "This is your land?" "No, ma'am. Just passing through." "So am I." She looked back down at the grave. Or I was. Jake took a few careful steps closer, keeping his hands where she could see them. Some women were afraid of men like him, and they were smart to be. He was tall and weathered, with scars on his hands and a gun that sat too easy on his hip. His face had the hard lines that came from years of looking over his shoulder. "Recent?" he asked, nodding toward the grave. 3 days ago. The same 3 days Jake had been riding alone. While he had been moving through the desert thinking about nothing but water and the next town, this woman had been digging a grave and saying goodbye to someone who mattered. "I'm sorry for your loss." She nodded but didn't speak. Jake could see she was fighting to keep her composure, the way people do when kindness from a stranger threatens to break down the walls they've built to hold themselves together. "My name is Jake Morrison," he said. "Sarah Coleman." She touched the wooden cross gently. "This is my brother, Thomas." The name hung in the air between them like dust motes in sunlight. Jake felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. It might have been compassion, Or it might have been recognition. Sometimes the two felt the same. What happened to him? Sarah was quiet for so long that Jake thought she wouldn't answer. The wind moved through the cedar branches above them, making a sound like whispered secrets. He tried to be a hero, she said finally. Something cold moved through Jake's stomach. He had known heroes once, had been one, or thought he was. Heroes had a way of ending up in graves with wooden crosses and grieving sisters. He was only 19, Sarah continued. Still believed that good men always win and bad men always lose. Still believed that drawing fast and shooting straight was enough to make the world right. Jake's hand moved unconsciously toward his gun, then stopped. The weight of it on his hip suddenly felt heavier than usual. There was a man in town causing trouble, Sarah said. Drunk and mean, pushing folks around. Thomas thought he could handle it. Thought his badge would be enough. He was a lawman, deputy sheriff. 3 weeks on the job. Sarah's laugh was bitter and broken. 3 weeks of wearing that tin star like it was made of gold. 3 weeks of believing that right makes might instead of the other way around. The sun was sinking lower now, painting the sky the color of old blood. Jake felt the familiar ache in his chest that came with sunset, the time of day when memories had a way of rising up like ghosts. The man was faster, Sarah said simply. Thomas never even cleared leather. Jake closed his eyes. He could see it happen, had seen it happen too many times before. The young lawman's hand moving for his gun with the confidence of inexperience. The older man's draw, smooth and practiced and deadly. The sound of gunfire echoing off wooden buildings. The look of surprise on a young face as death came calling 3 weeks too early. "I'm sorry," he said again, and meant it more than he had meant anything in a long time. Sarah looked up at him, and in her eyes Jake saw something that made him want to step back into the shadows. She was studying his face the way people studied wanted posters, taking in the details and filing them away. "You're a gunman," she said. It wasn't a question. Jake's jaw tightened. "I've carried a gun. You've used it too." He thought about lying, but something in her steady gaze made dishonesty impossible. "Yes." Sarah nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. "How many? Ma'am, how many young men like Thomas have you put in graves like this one?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. He felt his breath catch in his throat, felt the weight of every bullet he had ever fired and every life he had ever taken settling on his shoulders like lead blankets. "I don't know," he said quietly. "You don't know." Sarah's voice was flat, empty of accusation, but full of something worse. Understanding. "I stopped counting," Jake admitted. They sat in silence as the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon. Jake wanted to leave, wanted to climb back on his horse and ride until the cedar trees and the grave and Sarah Coleman's knowing eyes were far behind him. But his feet seemed rooted to the earth, as if the weight of all those unmarked graves was holding him in place. "Will you stay?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Ma'am, tonight, will you stay until morning?" Jake looked at her kneeling there beside her brother's grave and saw something in her face that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear or loneliness, though both of those things were there too. It was something deeper, something that recognized the darkness in him and wasn't afraid of it. "I don't think that a good idea," he said. "Please." The word came out soft and broken. "I don't want to be alone with him tonight. Not the first night." Jake felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he had built and maintained for years. Looking at Sarah Coleman, he saw every sister and mother and wife who had ever knelt beside a grave and asked the empty sky why their good man had to die while men like him kept breathing. "All right," he heard himself say. "I'll stay." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jake settled his back against one of the cedar trees and prepared for a long night of keeping watch over a dead boy and a grieving sister, wondering what stories the darkness might bring and whether he was ready to hear them. The night came slowly, creeping between the cedar branches like a cat stalking prey. Jake gathered dry wood while Sarah sat beside her brother's grave, her fingers tracing the letters carved into the wooden cross. Thomas Coleman, born 1854, died 1873. The dates looked too close together, like bookends holding nothing but empty space. Jake built the fire small and careful, the way he had learned in places where large flames drew the wrong kind of attention. The light flickered across Sarah's face, showing the tracks her tears had made through the desert dust on her cheeks. "You don't have to tell me about him," Jake said, settling back against his tree. "Sometimes it's better to keep the good memories close and quiet." Sarah shook her head. "If I don't tell someone, who will remember the way he laughed when he thought no one was listening? Who will remember that he used to practice his quick draw in the mirror every morning before breakfast?" Jake felt something twist in his stomach. He remembered practicing his own draw once, years ago, when he still believed speed and accuracy could make a man righteous. Back when he thought the gun was just a tool, like a hammer or a plow. "Tell me," he said quietly. Sarah reached in her travel bag and pulled out a small tin pot and a pouch of coffee. Her hands moved with the automatic grace of someone who had made camp in lonely places before. "Thomas was born when I was 12, she began, measuring coffee into the pot. "Our parents died when he was 7. Fever took them both in the same week." Jake watched her add water from her canteen to the pot and set it carefully in the coals at the edge of the fire. The flames licked at the metal, and steam began to rise like tiny ghosts. "I raised him after that," Sarah continued. "Try to be mother and father and sister all at once. Taught him to read and write and figure numbers. Taught him to cook and mend clothes and tend a garden. But I never taught him the most important thing." "What was that?" "That some fights aren't worth winning." The coffee began to bubble, filling the air with a rich smell that reminded Jake of better times, when he used to sit around campfires with men who were friends instead of just people who hadn't tried to kill him yet. "Thomas had this idea about justice," Sarah said. "He thought it was something you could hold in your hand like a rock or a piece of wood. Something solid and real that would always be there when you needed it." She poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to Jake. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and he felt the calluses on her hands, the kind that came from hard work and making do. "Where did he get that idea?" Jake asked, though he thought he already knew. "From me." Sarah's voice was barely louder than the crackling of the fire. "From the stories I told him about our father. About how good men always find a way to do right, even when right is hard to find." Jake sipped his coffee and tasted the bitterness of truth. "Your father was a lawman? Sheriff. Gunned down when Thomas was 5. I told Thomas he died, defending innocent people from bad men. I told him his father was a hero who gave his life so others could live in peace." That might have been true. Sarah looked at Jake across the fire, and in her eyes he saw the weight of years spent carrying lies that had grown too heavy to hold. "It wasn't," she said simply. "Our father was drunk when he died. He picked a fight with the wrong man over a card game and got himself shot in front of the saloon. There was nothing heroic about it. Nothing noble or right or just." Jake set down his coffee cup and stared into the fire. The flames danced and shifted, showing him shapes that might have been faces or might have been nothing at all. "But I couldn't tell Thomas that," Sarah continued. "He was so young, and he missed his father so much. So I gave him a hero instead of the truth. I gave him stories about justice and righteousness and good men who always do the right thing. And he believed them. He more than believed them. He lived them. Every decision he made, every choice he faced, he would ask himself what his hero father would have done. And the answer was always the same. Stand up. Fight back. Don't let the bad men win." A piece of wood shifted in the fire, sending sparks up toward the stars. Jake watched them rise and fade, like tiny lives burning bright and brief. 3 weeks ago, Thomas pinned on that deputy's badge, Sarah said. He was so proud. Said he was finally old enough to carry on his father's work. Said he was going to make me proud. And you were proud. I was terrified. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she lifted her coffee to her lips. I knew what kind of men wear badges in towns like Cedar Creek. I knew what happened to young men who thought right makes might. But Thomas was so happy, so sure of himself. I couldn't take that away from him. Jake thought about all the young men he had faced over the years. Boys with new badges and old ideas about justice. Boys who drew their guns with the confidence of youth and died with the surprise of experience. The man who killed him, Jake said carefully. What was his name? Caleb Rush. The name hit Jake like a punch to the chest. He knew Rush by reputation, had heard stories about him in saloons and around campfires. A gun for hire who took jobs that other men wouldn't touch. Fast with a pistol and slow with mercy. You know him, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. I know of him. Men like him, Sarah said, staring into the fire. Men like you. How many Thomas Colemans have you killed? Jake felt the question settle into his bones like winter cold. He thought about all the young lawmen who had tried to prove themselves against his reputation. All the boys who had drawn on him thinking they were faster, thinking they were better, thinking they were righteous. Too many, he said. Did they have sisters? Mothers? People who loved them and believed in them? I expect they did. Sarah nodded slowly. And you killed them anyway. I defended myself by being the kind of man they felt they had to defend against. The truth of it sat between them like a third person at the fire. Jake had spent years telling himself that he only killed men who tried to kill him first, that he was just defending himself against people who wanted his reputation or his life. But looking at Sarah Coleman across her brother's grave, he saw the other side of that story, the side that ended with wooden crosses and fresh dirt and women crying alone in the dark. I never meant for it to be this way, Jake said. What did you mean? Jake stared into the fire and tried to remember when he had stopped being a man who carried a gun and started being a gun that happened to be carried by a man. I wanted to help people, he said finally. I wanted to be one of the good men. What happened? The first time I killed someone, it was to save a family from road agents. The second time, it was to stop a man from beating a woman to death. The third time, it was because someone had heard about the first two times and wanted to see if I was as fast as they said. Sarah poured herself more coffee, her movements careful and deliberate. And after that, it didn't matter why I started. All that mattered was the gun on my hip and the speed in my hand. Men came looking for me, and I killed them, and more men came looking for me. Like Thomas. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the wind move through the cedar branches. Jake thought about all the campfires he had sat beside, all the nights he had spent alone with his thoughts and his regrets. Do you remember their faces? Sarah asked suddenly. Jake closed his eyes and saw them all. Young faces and old faces. Scared faces and angry faces. Faces that looked surprised when his bullet found them. Faces that looked relieved. All of them, he said. Do you think about them? Every day. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The night was getting colder, and the fire seemed smaller against the darkness surrounding them. Thomas used to have nightmares, she said. Even before he became a deputy. He would dream about facing down bad men in the street, about drawing his gun and being faster than lightning. He would wake up excited, like the dreams were promises instead of warnings. Jake remembered having dreams like that once. Dreams where he was the hero of his own story, where every bullet he fired made the world a little safer, a little more just. I should have told him the truth about our father, Sarah said. Should have told him that heroes die just as easy as anyone else, and they leave behind just as much pain. Maybe he wouldn't have listened. Maybe not, but at least I would have tried. A coyote called out in the distance, its voice lonely and wild. The sound echoed off the rocks and faded into silence. What will you do now? Jake asked. Sarah looked down at her brother's grave, at the wooden cross and the wilted flowers and the carefully arranged stones. I don't know, she said. I came here to bury him and say goodbye. I thought I would know what to do after that. Jake understood that feeling. He had been drifting from town to town for months now, looking for something he couldn't name and running from something he couldn't escape. Where is home? He asked. There isn't one anymore. Thomas was all the family I had left. The fire burned lower, casting longer shadows and softer light. Jake found himself studying Sarah's face in the flickering glow, seeing strength there alongside the grief. She had lost everything, but she was still here, still breathing, still fighting to make sense of a world that took good men and left broken ones behind. I keep thinking about what he said, Sarah whispered. Right before he died. What was that? The doctor said Thomas asked for me with his last breath. Asked if his father would have been proud. Jake felt something break inside his chest, some last wall between him and the full weight of what he had done with his life. What did you tell him? I told him yes, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face again. I told him his father would have been proud of the man he became. It was the last lie I ever told him. Jake stared into the dying fire and wondered if there was any way to make amends for a lifetime of creating graves like this one, if there was any road back from being the kind of man that boys like Thomas died trying to stop. As the flames settled into glowing coals, he found himself hoping that Sarah's tears might somehow wash away the blood on his hands, even as he knew that some stains went too deep to ever come clean. Jake woke before dawn, the way he always did. Years of sleeping with one ear open and one hand near his gun had trained his body to wake at the first hint of light, when the world was still soft enough to hide in, but bright enough to see danger coming. The fire had burned down to gray ash and glowing embers. Sarah lay curled on her side, near her brother's grave, using her travel bag as a pillow. Her face looked younger in sleep, peaceful in a way that made Jake's chest ache. He wondered when he had last slept that peacefully, without dreams full of gunfire and falling bodies. Moving carefully so as not to wake her, Jake added kindling to the coals and coaxed the fire back to life. The small flames danced and grew, pushing back the pre-dawn cold that had settled over the cedar grove like a gray blanket. As he worked, Jake found himself looking at Thomas Coleman's grave. The wooden cross stood straight and simple in the growing light, and the stones Sarah had arranged around it caught the fire's glow. Someone had loved this boy enough to dig his grave by hand in the hard desert earth. Someone had cared enough to mark his resting place and speak his name to a stranger. Jake tried to remember if anyone had ever spoken his name with that kind of tenderness. Sarah stirred as the sun touched the tops of the cedar trees. She sat up slowly, blinking in the morning light, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. For a moment she looked confused, as if she had forgotten where she was. Then her eyes found her brother's grave, and Jake watched the weight of memory settle back onto her face. "Morning," she said quietly. "Morning." Jake poured coffee from the pot he had kept warm at the edge of the fire and handed her a cup. Sarah wrapped her hands around it and breathed in the steam, using the warmth to wake herself fully. "I dreamed about him," she said. "Good dreams. He was 7 again, before he knew what guns were for, before he knew that good men could die just as easy as bad ones." Sarah sipped her coffee and stared at the grave. "In the dream, we were planting a garden behind our old house. Tomatoes and beans and carrots. Thomas kept asking if the seeds would really grow into something we could eat." Jake felt something twist in his chest. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that if we took care of them, if we gave them water and good soil and time, they would grow into something beautiful." The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the smell of cedar and sage and the faint sweetness of the wildflowers Sarah had placed around the grave. Jake breathed it in and tried to remember the last time he had noticed how the world smelled in the morning. "I want to fix his grave," Sarah said suddenly. "What's wrong with it?" "It's too simple, too bare." She set down her coffee and stood, brushing dust from her dress. "Thomas deserves better than a wooden cross and some wilted flowers." Jake watched as Sarah knelt beside the grave and began pulling weeds that had already started to sprout in the soft earth. Her movements were gentle and purposeful, the way a mother might tend a sleeping child. "What did you have in mind?" "Stones," Sarah said, not looking up from her work. "A proper border to keep the weeds out. Maybe some plants that will grow here in the desert. Something that will last." Jake found himself standing and walking to the edge of the cedar grove, where loose stones had been scattered by years of wind and weather. Without thinking about why, he began gathering the flattest ones he could find. They were warm from yesterday's sun and smooth from centuries of desert storms. When he returned with his arms full of stones, Sarah looked up at him with surprise and something else. Something that might have been gratitude or recognition or hope. You don't have to help, she said. I know. They worked together in comfortable silence, arranging the stones around Thomas Coleman's grave in a neat rectangle. Jake found himself taking care with each placement, making sure the stones fit together like pieces of a puzzle. It had been years since he had built something instead of destroying it. As they worked, Jake thought about all the graves he had never seen, all the wooden crosses and carved headstones that marked the men he had killed. He wondered if their sisters had knelt beside fresh dirt and arranged stones with the same careful tenderness Sarah showed her brother. Tell me about him, Jake said as he fitted a particularly stubborn stone into place. Before the badge, before the ideas about justice. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since Jake had found her crying, the expression reached her eyes. He was stubborn, she said. Once he got an idea in his head, you couldn't shake it loose with dynamite. When he was 8, he decided he was going to build a boat so we could sail to California. Never mind that we lived 200 miles from the nearest river big enough to float a cork. Did he build it? Started to. Spent 3 weeks collecting driftwood and old boards. I found him in the barn one morning, trying to nail pieces together with a hammer he could barely lift. The boat looked more like a coffin than anything that might float, but he was so proud of it. Jake could picture it perfectly. A serious boy with his tongue stuck out in concentration, working on a dream that made no sense to anyone but him. What happened to the boat? I helped him finish it, Sarah said. We carried it out to the stock pond behind our house and launched it with great ceremony. It sank immediately, of course. But Thomas just laughed and said we would build a better one next time. Did you? Every summer until he turned 12. We must have built 6 or 7 boats, each one a little better than the last. None of them ever stayed afloat for more than a minute, but Thomas never gave up trying. Jake found himself smiling at the image of Sarah and her young brother launching doomed vessels into a farm pond, both of them believing that the next attempt would be the one that worked. He sounds like he was a good kid. The best. Sarah's voice caught slightly. Even when he got older and started talking about badges and justice and following in our father's footsteps, he still had that same spirit. That belief that if you worked hard enough and cared enough, you could make things better. Jake thought about his own boyhood, about the dreams he had carried before the world taught him that caring too much could get you killed. He had wanted to be a doctor once, had imagined himself healing people instead of hurting them. But doctors needed education and money and time to learn, and Jake had been too poor and too impatient for any of those things. I was like him once, Jake said quietly. Sarah looked up from the stone she was positioning. What happened? Jake stared at the grave they were building together, at the careful work of their hands creating something permanent and beautiful. The first man I killed was named Johnny Walsh, Jake said. He was robbing a stagecoach full of families. I was riding by and heard the screaming. There was a little girl, maybe 5 years old, crying for her mother. Sarah's hands stilled on the stones. I drew my gun and told Walsh to let them go. He laughed at me, said I looked too young and too stupid to be dangerous. When he turned his pistol toward that little girl, I shot him. You saved them. I did. And for a while, that felt like enough. I felt like I had done something that mattered. Like I was the kind of man who protected innocent people from bad ones. Jake picked up another stone and turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight and texture. But word got around about what I had done, about how fast I was, how steady my hand was under pressure. Men started seeking me out. Some wanted to hire my gun. Others wanted to test themselves against it. And you let them. At first, I thought I could choose. Only take jobs protecting people who needed protecting. Only fight men who deserve fighting. But it doesn't work that way. Once you build a reputation with a gun, the gun starts making the choices for you. Sarah resumed her work, but Jake could feel her listening with every part of herself. The second man I killed was a kid from Kansas. Couldn't have been older than Thomas. He tracked me to a saloon in Dodge City and called me out in front of everyone. Said he was going to be the man who killed Jake Morrison. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he placed his stone in the growing border. I tried to talk him out of it. Told him to go home to his family, to find something better to do with his life than die in the street for nothing. But he wouldn't listen. He was so sure he was faster, so sure he was going to be famous. What was his name? The question surprised Jake. In all the years since, no one had ever asked him that. Billy Summers, Jake said, and saying the name felt like lifting a weight he had carried for too long. He had red hair and freckles and a gun that was too big for his hand. Sarah nodded, as if she had expected that answer. Did he have people who loved him? I don't know. I never asked. I never wanted to know. They finished the stone border as the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows between the cedar trees. The grave looked different now, cared for and protected, like something that belonged in this place instead of something that had been hastily carved out of it. Sarah stood and brushed dust from her hands, studying their work. It's good, she said. Thomas would have liked it. Jake stood beside her, looking down at what they had built together. The stones formed a perfect rectangle around the fresh dirt, and the wooden cross stood straight and strong at the head of the grave. We need plants, Sarah said. Something that will grow here. I saw some desert roses growing near the creek, Jake offered. They're hardy. They'll survive the heat and cold both. Sarah looked at him with something like wonder. You know about plants? Jake felt his cheeks warm. My mother had a garden. Before she died, she taught me which things would grow where. For the next hour, they walked together through the desert around the cedar grove, looking for plants that might take root in the cemetery they were creating. Jake found himself seeing the landscape through different eyes, noticing the small green things that managed to thrive in the harsh country. They dug carefully with their hands and Jake's knife, moving small desert roses and clumps of hardy grass to the space around Thomas's grave. The work was slow and meditative, and Jake found a peace in it that he hadn't felt in years. As they worked, Sarah talked about her brother's love of growing things, about the small garden they had kept behind their house, and Thomas's excitement every spring when the first green shoots appeared. He used to say that planting something was like making a promise to the future, Sarah said as she patted soil around a transplanted desert rose. A promise that you would be there to tend it, to help it grow. Jake thought about all the promises he had broken over the years, all the futures he had cut short with his gun. But here, kneeling in the dirt beside Thomas Coleman's grave, he felt something new stirring in his chest. Not redemption exactly, but the possibility of it. Sarah, he said as they finished their planting. Yes. Jake looked at the grave they had tended together, at the careful border of stones and the small plants that would grow and bloom long after they were gone. I want to tell you about all of them, all the men I killed. Their names, if I can remember them. The ones who had families waiting. The ones who died for nothing but pride and reputation. Sarah's hands stilled in the soil. Why? Jake thought about Billy Summers with his red hair and his gun that was too big for his hand. About all the boys who had died, trying to be faster than death itself. Because someone should remember them, Jake said. Someone should speak their names and know that they mattered to somebody. Sarah looked at him across her brother's grave, and in her eyes Jake saw something that might have been forgiveness, or at least the beginning of it. All right, she said quietly, but not here. Not at Thomas's grave. Somewhere else. Somewhere we can build something for all of them. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't name. The idea that Sarah would help him remember his victims, would help him build something beautiful from the ashes of his destructive life, seemed too generous to be real. Why would you do that? He asked. Sarah stood and brushed soil from her hands, looking at the small garden they had created around her brother's resting place. Because carrying that much grief alone will kill you, she said. And because I think Thomas would have wanted me to help you find a way to live with what you've done. As the morning sun climbed toward noon, Jake looked around the cedar grove that had become a sanctuary for two broken people learning to tend something together, wondering if healing always started this way, with gentle hands and shared work, and the hope that something good might grow from ground that had known too much sorrow. 3 weeks passed before Jake spoke Billy Summers' name again. He had built Sarah a small cabin in the cedar grove by then, using wood from dead trees and stones from the creek bed. The work kept his hands busy and his mind quiet, and each day he felt a little less like the man who had ridden into this place, carrying nothing but guilt and a gun. Sarah had planted more flowers around Thomas's grave, and they were taking root in the desert soil. She tended them each morning with water from the creek, talking to her brother's headstone like he might answer back. Jake had learned not to interrupt these conversations. Some words were meant for the dead alone. On the morning he finally spoke Billy's name, Jake was sitting by the creek sharpening his knife. The blade caught the early sunlight and threw it back in bright flashes. Sarah was washing clothes in the shallow water, humming a song Jake didn't recognize. Billy Summers was 19, Jake said suddenly. Sarah's hands stilled in the water. She had been waiting for this moment, Jake knew, had been patient while he found the courage to begin. "Tell me about him," she said quietly. Jake set down his knife and stared at the water moving over the stones. He rode a buckskin horse with white markings on its face. The horse was beautiful, better than Billy deserved, probably. It kept nuzzling his shoulder while we faced off in the street. What did he look like? Red hair, like I said, freckles across his nose. His gun belt was new leather, still stiff. He kept adjusting it like it didn't fit right. Jake picked up a smooth stone from the creek bed and turned it over in his palm. He was scared, trying hard not to show it, but his hands were shaking. Sarah resumed her washing, but Jake could tell she was listening with every part of herself. "I could have walked away," Jake continued. "Could have finished my drink and left town. But there were people watching. Men I knew, men who would have said I was getting soft. And Billy called me a coward in front of everyone. So you killed him." "So I killed him." Jake threw the stone into the creek and watched the ripples spread. "His mother came to see his body the next day. I was still in town, and she found me at the saloon." Sarah's washing stopped completely now. She was a small woman, gray hair, worn hands. She didn't cry or scream or curse me. She just looked at me for a long time, like she was trying to understand something. "What did she say?" "She asked me if I had children of my own. When I said no, she nodded like that explained everything. Then she asked if Billy had suffered." Jake felt his throat tighten at the memory. "I told her it was quick, that he didn't feel any pain. It was the only kindness I could give her." "Was it true?" "No." Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "Billy lived for almost 10 minutes after I shot him. He kept trying to say something, kept reaching for that buckskin horse. I should have stayed with him, should have held his hand or spoken some words of comfort. But I was already walking away before he hit the ground." Sarah came out of the water and sat beside Jake on the creek bank. Her dress was wet at the hem, and water droplets caught the morning light like tiny stars. "What was his mother's name?" she asked. "I never asked. I should have, but I didn't. We'll call her Mrs. Summers then. We'll remember her too." Jake felt something break loose in his chest at those words. The idea that Sarah would help him carry not just the weight of his victims, but the grief of those they left behind seemed too generous to accept. Over the following days, Jake spoke other names into the quiet air between them. Frank Mueller, who had a wife and twin daughters in Missouri. Carlos Vega, who drew on Jake outside a church on Sunday morning. Tom Bradley, who was drunk and probably wouldn't have even remembered the fight if he had lived to see morning. Each name was a stone added to the cairn of Jake's confession. Each story was a small step towards something that might eventually become forgiveness, though Jake wasn't sure he deserved it. Sarah listened to all of it without judgment, helping Jake remember details he had tried to forget. She asked questions that mattered. Did they have families? What do they want from life? How old were they when they died? Why does it help? Jake asked one evening as they sat by the fire outside Sarah's cabin. "Talking about them, I mean, it doesn't bring them back." Sarah was mending a tear in one of his shirts, her needle moving in small, careful stitches. "My grandmother used to say that the dead aren't really gone as long as someone speaks their names. As long as someone remembers that they lived and mattered to somebody. I took that away from them." "You did, but now you're giving something back." Jake thought about that as he watched the fire dance and shift. The flames reminded him of all the campfires he had sat beside over the years, all the lonely nights when he had been the only person who knew where he was or cared if he lived or died. "Sarah," he said carefully, "yes, what we're building here, this life, it won't bring Thomas back either." Sarah's hands stilled on the mending. "I know, and it won't make me a good man. Won't erase what I've done. I know that too. Jake stared into the fire and tried to find the words for what he was feeling. Then why are we doing it? Sarah set down her mending and looked at him across the firelight. In her eyes, Jake saw something he was only beginning to recognize in himself: the possibility of hope. Because the alternative is to let the dying win, she said simply. Thomas died believing in something good. If I spend the rest of my life grieving and angry, then what he believed in dies with him. And the men I killed, they died for nothing if nothing good comes from remembering them. But if their names help you become someone who builds instead of destroys, then maybe their deaths weren't completely meaningless. Jake felt tears sting his eyes, the first he had allowed himself to cry in more years than he could count. I want to build something for them, he said. A place where people can come and remember the ones they've lost. Not just the ones I killed, but all the ones who died too young for stupid reasons. Sarah smiled, and in that smile Jake saw the same hope that had kept her brother believing in justice even when justice failed him. Where? She asked. Here, in the grove with Thomas. We could clear more land, build benches, and plant more flowers. People could come and sit quiet and remember. A garden for the dead. A garden for the living, too. A place where grieving people could find some peace. Sarah picked up her mending again, but Jake could see her mind working, planning. We'd need supplies. Tools and lumber and flower seeds. That takes money. Jake thought about the small leather pouch in his saddlebags, the wages he had earned from his last job guarding a silver shipment. Blood money, he had always called it, but maybe it could be used for something clean. I have some saved, he said. Not much, but enough to start. And then what? How do we live while we're building this place? I could hire out as a ranch hand. Honest work this time. No more guns for hire. Sarah looked at him steadily. You give up your reputation? Your speed with a pistol? That's all you've had to trade on for years. Jake unbuckled his gun belt and set it carefully beside the fire. The weight of it leaving his hip felt like freedom and terror all at once. I'm tired of being fast with death, he said. I want to try being slow with life instead. They worked through the winter, clearing more land in the cedar grove and building simple benches from split logs. Jake proved to be handy with tools, and Sarah had an eye for making practical things beautiful. Together, they created spaces where sorrow could rest without drowning. Word of their garden spread quietly through the surrounding towns. People began coming to sit among the cedar trees and remember their lost ones. They brought flowers and stones, and sometimes just their silence. Sarah would make coffee for anyone who wanted it, and Jake learned to listen without trying to fix what couldn't be mended. A woman named Elena Martinez came to mourn her son, killed in a mining accident. An old rancher named Pete Dawson built a small cross for his wife and tended it every Sunday. A young mother brought wildflowers for the baby she had lost to fever, and Jake found himself weeping with her as she spoke the child's name to the desert wind. Each visitor added something to the garden, and slowly the cedar grove became a place of healing rather than just a repository for grief. Jake found that tending other people's sorrows helped ease the weight of his own. On a warm spring morning, exactly 1 year after Jake had first found Sarah crying at her brother's grave, he woke to find her standing among the flowers they had planted together. The desert roses were blooming, their pink petals bright against the green cedar branches. I dreamed about Thomas again, she said when Jake joined her. Good dreams. The best. We were in the garden behind our old house, but it was this garden too, somehow. Dreams don't worry much about making sense. Sarah touched one of the rose blooms gently. He was proud of what we've built here. Said it was better than any boat we ever made. Jake smiled at that. Over the long winter evenings, Sarah had told him many stories about her brother's boat-building phase. The image of young Thomas launching hopeful vessels into the farm pond had become one of Jake's favorite memories, even though he had never been there to see it. There's something else, Sarah said. What? In the dream, Thomas asked me if I was happy. Jake felt his heart quicken. In all the months they had worked together, neither of them had spoken directly about what was growing between them alongside the flowers and memorial stones. What did you tell him? Sarah turned to look at Jake, and in her eyes he saw something deeper than contentment, something that might actually be joy. I told him I was learning how to be, she said. Jake reached for her hand, and when she took it, he felt the calluses they had earned together through shared work and purpose. Sarah, he said carefully. Yes, I love you. The words hung in the morning air like a prayer offered without certainty of an answer. Sarah was quiet for so long that Jake began to fear he had spoken too soon, asked for too much. I love you too, she said finally, but I need you to understand something. What's that? I'm not forgiving you because I love you. I'm loving you because I've chosen to forgive you. There's a difference. Jake nodded, understanding flowing through him like cool water. Sarah's love wasn't a reward for his redemption. It was a gift freely given, independent of whether he deserved it. Understand, he said. Do you? Because there will be hard days ahead. Days when the guilt comes back strong and you remember why you started running in the first place. Days when I remember that you're the kind of man who might have killed Thomas if you had met him in different circumstances. Jake felt the truth of that settle into his bones. And on those days, we'll tend the garden together. We'll speak the names of the ones we've lost and the ones we've learned to carry. We'll remember that forgiveness isn't a feeling you have once and keep forever. It's a choice you make new every morning. Jake looked around the cedar grove they had transformed together, at the benches and flowers and small memorials that marked other people's losses and hopes. It wasn't grand or perfect, but it was real. It was a place where broken things could rest and maybe, with time and care, begin to heal. Every morning, he asked. Sarah squeezed his hand and smiled, the expression lighting up her face like sunrise breaking over the desert. Every morning, she promised. As the sun climbed higher over Cedar Ridge, Jake Morrison stood among the flowers he had planted and felt something he had thought lost forever, the possibility of deserving the life he had been given. It would not be an easy redemption or a complete one, but it would be his own, built stone by careful stone in the company of someone brave enough to love him while he learned to forgive himself. The cedar trees whispered their approval in the morning wind, guardians of a quiet miracle that had grown from grief into something like grace, measured not in moments of dramatic change, but in the patient accumulation of days spent choosing, again and again, to tend what was broken until it could hold beauty once more.